Hi, this is Mr. Titanium, i.e. Richard Wagner. I'm your host, Richard Wagner, and I am so happy to be here. Today, we're going to be discussing the 1962 Nobel Prize for Science. The 1962 Nobel Prize for Science was awarded to James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins for the elucidation of the structure of DNA. But there's one person, one vital person, who did the lion's share of the work, who was left off that list. And that person is Rosalind Franklin. And I'm here to tell you her story. Now, before we get into any types of conspiratorial thoughts, Rosalind Franklin died very young at the age of 38. And the reason why she wasn't included on the stage with the other gentlemen was because she passed away before she could have won the award. And the award is never given to somebody posthumously. So that's what happened there. However, Rosalind Franklin was born in 1920 in London to an Ashkenazi Jewish family. She went to Cambridge. She graduated in 1941, but back then, even though she was top of her class, Cambridge didn't give women degrees, but what they gave her was a certificate. So with that certificate, she went on and to try and get a doctoral degree. And she successfully defended her thesis. And indeed, in 1945, Cambridge once again gave her none other than her certificate. Rosalind Franklin left to go to France, where she studied coal and graphite. She used X-ray crystallography, and she prolifically wrote papers. And this was at the perfect time because Europe was in a real bind. They needed a dense energy source, and Rosalind Franklin came to the rescue. But her papers were noticed by none other than John Randall. It turns out that John Randall was the department head of biophysics at the King's College in London. And he wrote to her and he said, "Hey, how would you like to head up the biophysics department here? We have the best equipment. I'll give you full autonomy. You'll work on proteins and DNA." Rosalind Franklin wrote back. She couldn't believe what he was saying, and she specifically asked him, "Am I going to be in charge?" And he said, "Yes, you're going to be in charge and you're going to have full autonomy over the work." Well, the one thing that he didn't tell her was that there was this gentleman, Maurice Wilkins. Maurice Wilkins was already at King's College working on DNA. He scrounged to get the money for the camera he used. He worked nights and weekends and believed that DNA was his destiny. While off in a conference in Bermuda, John Randall sneakily took all of his research, all of his equipment, and even his lab assistant, Raymond Gosselin, and gave them all to Franklin. Now, Franklin wasn't aware that Wilkinson was around. When he returned, suntanned and stunned, he saw that his entire lab was taken over by Franklin. So he confronted John Randall. He says, why did you do this to me? And John Randall kind of smirks, blows it off flippantly, and says, well, Rosalind's better at fibers than you, and walks away. Well, Wilkins never forgot that and never forgot how he got stabbed in the back. He held that animosity to his grave. So you can imagine that the tension between Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins was significant. Well, it turns out that Rosalind made some great success. She wound up modifying Wilkins' camera, and these modifications enabled her and her lab assistant to produce Photograph 51. And Photograph 51 was the most perfect illustration of the double helix. With that, she was primed and ready to produce a paper that would forever change the way we looked at genetics. And just at that point in time, ironically enough, Linus Pauling from the United States published his own model of DNA. Now, you have to understand that Pauling was just a giant in the field. He recently discovered a very important structural motif in proteins called the alpha helix. So everybody knew of him. But what people knew was that the model he described, although very elegant, was wrong. The phosphate group was in the wrong position, was in the wrong orientation. However, Pauling's article had a chilling effect on Watson and Crick. James Watson just said it was over, and they took their research, which was this half-baked double helix model, and they just shoved it on the shelf and began to work on something different. Well, it turns out that Maurice Wilkins found out about the Cambridge crew shelving their DNA research, and he knew what Rosalind knew of Photograph 51. So one day he goes into Franklin's lab and steals the negative, steals the image. Well, maybe steals the wrong word. Maybe the right word's borrowed, but borrowed without permission. So whatever you want to call that. And he runs right over to James Watson at Cambridge. And he takes this image and he gives it to James Watson. And he tells James Watson he can use it. Now, the moment that James Watson sees this image, he knew exactly what it was. And he started making measurements and he started doing all sorts of different things. The very next day, he and Francis Crick cracked it and had a working model. And a month later, in April of 1953, they published their paper on the structure of DNA in Nature, essentially scooping Rosalind Franklin, utilizing her data. And you know how obnoxious James Watson was? James Watson actually sent Rosalind Franklin a postcard thanking her for her photo, yet barely giving her any attribution in the article that he wrote. saying basically that she and Wilkins stimulated their thought on this based upon some unpublished research. Without that photograph, they had bupkis. They were nowhere. And what was worse was that at the time, James Watson published his autobiography, and he had such disparaging things to say about Rosalind Franklin. In fact, what he wrote about Franklin left such a bad taste in Francis Crick's mouth that the two of them had a falling out. Well, anyways, when Rosalind got the postcard that said, "Thanks for the photograph," she knew exactly what happened. And she had it with King's College. And instead, she got a position at Birkbeck College. And she took her lab assistant, Raymond Gosselin, with her. But James Randall, first of all, made her stay for an extra 6 months. And then after having her stay for those extra 6 months, wouldn't even allow her to take her research and her data. Well, 6 months went by. She transferred to her new school. She set up her lab. They started doing research on something known as tobacco mosaic virus. Well, Rosalind Franklin did it once again. She created the foundation of modern virology. She described the single strand and a helical protein capsid and how viruses take over the replication machinery of the cell in order to reproduce. She did it all. Of course, by then, she got sick with ovarian cancer. Some people think that it was from all the radiation she was exposed to. However, as I mentioned earlier, she was an Ashkenazi Jew, and the BRCA mutations run in her family. And it's conceivable that she was genetically predisposed to ovarian cancer, and perhaps the radiation contributed, perhaps it didn't. We'll never know. But as she got sick, one of the saving graces was a reconciliation with Francis Crick. And it turned out that Francis Crick's wife became really friendly with Rosalind. Odell Crick, she was an artist. And it turned out that she invited her to her home in Cambridge and took care of her and cooked for her and helped her with her correspondences. And, Rosalind even wrote home and said that her relationship with Odell helped alleviate a lot of the hurt that she'd experienced. Well, maybe history won't remember Rosalind Franklin, but at least she was treated decently in the very end. Interestingly, in 1962, a week after the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins, Rosalind Franklin's parents get some mail. It's from Cambridge. Inside's a piece of parchment. It's Rosalind's PhD. They backdated it to 1945. When her mother got it, she cried. Well, the story goes on. While at Birkbeck College, she developed a collegial relationship with Eric Klug. Eric Klug continued her work on the tobacco mosaic virus. And as a result of that, he received the Nobel Prize in 1982. But do you think, what he said, I think essentially was that the methods were jointly developed. But I don't believe that his comments were strong enough and that I don't believe that he gave Rosalind Franklin the due credit that she deserved. Rosalind Franklin, in the 38 years of her life, deserves so much better. Thank you. Have a good evening.